Today we are heading to the townland of Ballyedmond, around 4 kilometres north of the town Middleton in County Cork, and back to the year 2005, specifically the 6th of January. The children are just getting over the excitement of Christmas, and the adults are recovering from the New Year's celebrations and trying to adjust to being back at work, adjusting their lives to accommodate their New Year's resolutions, which will more than likely fall to the wayside come February. But for the children, they would see returning to school as a positive, getting to tell their friends what they got for Christmas and catching up, as many would not have seen each other over the Christmas period. The most the children would have to contend with was being back to getting up for school on the early dark mornings and the cold. January could be a bitter cold month. One of these children was 11-year-old Robert Houlihan. He was excited to be back at school and couldn't wait to tell everyone that he had got a new silver BMX bike and of course a new mobile phone, which made him feel all grown up, especially because of the fact he had bought it himself out of the money he had been given for Christmas. Of course his parents, Mark and Magella, looked at it in a different way: safety. Robert was the eldest of 3 children and was big into his hurling and horses. Robert was a happy and outgoing child, and the only thing that he suffered from was that he was afraid of the dark, which many children are. On the 6th of January, 4 days before school resumed after the holidays, Robert decided to go out on his new bike. He didn't like getting it dirty, and every time he took it out, he made sure it was cleaned down thoroughly, ready for the next time. The area Robert lived in was perfect for BMX riding, with its narrow lanes and hills, and he knew the area like the back of his hand. He had spent that morning in his own driveway practicing stunts and going over ramps that he had built himself. But that afternoon, when he took out his bike again, he decided to go further afield and headed out from the security of his own home onto the road he knew so well. He would never be seen alive again. At around 3:30 p.m, Magella called Robert on his mobile phone, but it rang out. She was just ringing him to know what he wanted for dinner. He usually would only be out and about for an hour or so, and she knew he would be hungry when he got home and wanted to have it ready for him. Magella wasn't overly concerned. She knew he probably didn't hear the phone, or that he was having so much fun that he just didn't answer. But by 5:30 p.m, with Robert not returning her calls and Magella having called him 6 times by now with no reply, she began to feel worried. Also, it was dark outside, and as I said, Robert was afraid of the dark. Mark, his father, had by now returned home from work, and Magella told him of her concerns. They decided to send Emma, their daughter, to the nearest neighbour to see if Robert was there. There lived the O'Donohues. They had a 20-year-old son, Wayne, who Robert adored and who was happy to have the young boy around. But Wayne said he had not seen Robert since lunchtime and had no idea where he could be. By now, Mark and Magella were really worried, so they got in the car and drove around. They feared that Robert might have fallen off his bike or got lost in the dark. They drove as far as Middleton also, thinking Robert might have gone to McDonald's or to the GA grounds to meet with friends. But there was no sign of Robert. By 7 p.m, the Houlihan family had exhausted all possibilities: his friends, his neighbours and any local spots. They even searched places further afield. Nothing. It was time to call the Gardaí. Neighbours by now were also out looking for Robert, and soon the Gardaí would follow, doing door-to-door inquiries. At around 9 p.m. that same night, a local man and his son were driving home and they spotted a bike in the ditch around 2 kilometres from Robert's home. Unfortunately, because it was a brand new bike, they didn't want to leave it out in the elements, and so they picked it up and brought it home. They would tell Gardaí that even though it was found abandoned out in the middle of nowhere, it was parked neatly by the ditch. As most of you know, BMX bikes are one size fits all, but the seat was set down low, so they knew it belonged to a child. But before they had contacted the Gardaí, Wayne O'Donoghue had confirmed that it was Robert's bike, and he also told them that Robert was missing, and this is when they called the Gardaí. It was clear now to everyone that Robert was missing. There was no way he'd just leave his bike abandoned, the bike he cherished so much. By 11 p.m, the search for Robert was in full swing. Word had got around and people from the area, members of the local GA and Middleton town all gathered together, and Gardaí coordinated everyone into search parties. People searched for hours that first night, but finally they had to stop and resume the next morning. By the next morning, word had spread of Robert's disappearance, and by the evening it had made national news, which, by the third day, the media arrived at Robert's home to report on his disappearance. A Garda incident room was set up at a local golf club, and people gathered there to help with the search. Hot drinks and food was also brought for the volunteers. An area of nearly 10 kilometres from the Houlihan house was searched, along with small rivers and ponds by the Garda sub-aqua team. Slurry pits were drained and searched on the nearby farms, going back on themselves in case they missed something the first time. CCTV in Middleton was collected and looked at, but there was nothing. Any information the Gardaí were receiving led to nowhere. It was like Robert vanished off the face of the earth. Magella also gave media interviews. Her first thought was that he might be injured, but as time went on, she began to plead that whoever had him to please let him go. By the 9th of January, the Army and Civil Defence Force were called in to help with the search. By the 11th of January, a reconstruction was done of how Robert had left the house that day, which must have been so hard on the family as they watched through the window. The following day, the 12th of January, as Gardaí prepared to give a press conference on the case, word was coming through that something had been found near Inchstrand, which is around 21 kilometres from Ballyedmond, where the Houlihan family lived. The searches had been directed to a ditch that was near to the lane that led down to the beach. It was an isolated spot, especially at that time of year. The ditch was thick with brush and brambles, with a steep incline on the far side of the ditch. Just after 2 p.m. that day, one of the volunteers was searching this particular area, moving the brush aside with a stick, when he saw a dark-coloured sports shoe, and with further searching, a discovery was made of a body which resembled that of a small boy. When the discovery was made, the Gardaí cordoned off the area and awaited the arrival of the state pathologist Mary Cassidy and forensics. A doctor was called to pronounce the death, and a priest was called to administer the last rites. The Gardaí again did house-to-house inquiries, and through the media appealed to anyone who had seen anything suspicious to come forward. There had been a caravan parked in the area, and a van with foreign plates had been seen driving erratically. Word had gotten around that the body had been found wrapped in plastic bags, and that a small fire had been lit under the body. The state pathologist would not arrive until the next day. Locals contacted the radio station and complained that his body had been left out in the elements all night, and they knew this would have upset the family, as Robert was afraid of the dark. But what people didn't know was that on that night a Garda and his colleague had stood guard all night over the body, and that he was treated with as much care and respect as they would have treated their own children. The Garda in question contacted the local priest to tell the Houlihan family in the hope it would give them some comfort that Robert was not alone. This act of kindness was told by the priest at Robert's funeral, and the media latched onto it. The Garda involved was a little annoyed that the priest had betrayed his trust, and the priest felt a little guilty for telling the whole congregation. But the priest had an explanation. The priest had read out a letter from President Mary McAleese at the funeral, and following that he blurted out what the two Gardaí had done for Robert, showing the kindness in people at such a tragic event. The Garda said later in an interview, quote, "This is the type of thing that is done routinely by the men and women at An Garda Síochána. It is done quietly and usually goes unnoticed." On the evening of the 13th of January, Gardaí held a press conference confirming that the body found was Robert. They also confirmed that they were in the process of eliminating 36 known sex offenders. This came as a bit of a shock to the community, as many of these were not on the sex offenders database, having committed their crimes before this database came into existence. They also appealed to Robert's killer to come forward. Poor Robert had to be identified through dental records because of the length of time he was out in the elements, and unfortunately due to animal interference. He had been missing a total of 6 days. Robert had been asphyxiated and there was no sign of sexual assault. Dr. Mary Cassidy concluded that he had died due to being put in a headlock, and Gardaí concluded that the person who killed Robert had good upper body strength. They also managed to lift prints from the black plastic bags that the body was wrapped in, and they concluded that Robert had not died where he was found, and more than likely driven to Inch Strand and dumped there. Robert's funeral was held on the 15th of January in Middleton after being waked at his home, brought home for one last night, surrounded by his loving family and friends. All the businesses closed their doors on the day of the funeral, hanging black ribbons on their doors as a sign of mourning and respect. Almost 4,000 people turned up, with the church's capacity being 2,000. The rest stood outside. Robert's hurling hero said the prayers of the faithful at his funeral. His neighbour Wayne, who was like a big brother to Robert, told his girlfriend afterwards, saying if only he had taken him to town that day for ice cream, like he asked, he would still be alive today. The day after the funeral, the Gardaí received a phone call that would change everything. It was from one of the neighbours of the Houlihan's. They asked Gardaí to call to their house as they had information regarding Robert's death. When they arrived at the neighbour's house, a voluntary interview took place. That evening, after hearing what the neighbour had to say, Wayne O'Donoghue was brought to the Garda station in Middleton. The media had no idea who had been arrested, but knew someone was being held for questioning under Section 4 of the Criminal Justice Act, and a special hearing was going to be held where official charges were going to be made against this person. They also knew it was a neighbour of Robert's and was 20 years old, known to Robert, and he had helped in the search for him. Wayne O'Donoghue appeared at a special sitting of the District Court the next evening and was charged with the unlawful killing of little Robert. O'Donoghue was remanded in custody and no application for bail was made. His solicitor did ask for him to be remanded in custody in Cork prison so he could be near to his family, and this was granted. But because by now he had been named and it was such a high-profile case, they deemed it unsafe to put him in a Cork prison, and so he was remanded in the Midlands prison in Portlaoise for his own safety. O'Donoghue was from a good family and was studying to be an engineer, had a girlfriend and seemed normal. In November 2005, the trial began at the courthouse on Washington Street in Cork. 7 women and 5 men were selected, and Justice Paul Carney presided over the trial. The courtroom was packed as expected. People wanted to know why this happened. O'Donoghue sat in the dock, looking visibly changed. Prison life did not suit him. He had put on a lot of weight, his hair was overgrown, and he had an ashen complexion to his face. He pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter. The state would not accept this and proceeded with proving the charge of murder. The prosecution on their opening outlined O'Donoghue's actions. They said he got into a row with Robert, strangled him, moved his body to an area far away from his home, tried to discard evidence by burning Robert's body, and callously helped look for him, all the while knowing where he was. He did not even tell anyone of what he had done and did not even make an anonymous phone call to say where the body was. He let the parents of Robert go through 6 days of not knowing what had happened to their son. They pointed out that he only cracked after the body was found, and the overwhelming response to Robert's death, which was made clear at the funeral. The state was relying on O'Donoghue's statements that he made at his house and when he was arrested, plus the fingerprints found on the black plastic bags that Robert was found in matched his. They also said that since O'Donoghue was much older and bigger than Robert, putting his hands on him in an aggressive manner would most likely end in serious harm or death. Magella, Robert's mother, took to the stand on the second day of the trial. She described him as a happy, bubbly child that loved sports. He did have a mild form of ADHD and took a mild dose of Ritalin when he was in school, but never during the holidays, as he had plenty to do to work off the extra energy he had. She spoke about the day Robert went missing. She said his granddad had called that day around lunchtime to take him to see the horses. But Robert had been riding the day before and he only wanted to ride his bike that day, making ramps and riding up and down the road. She also told how she had phoned O'Donoghue at around 4:30 p.m. as it was getting dark and couldn't get through to Robert on his phone. Wayne had told her he hadn't seen Robert since lunchtime and she testified that O'Donoghue sounded normal on the phone. Mark, Robert's father, also took to the stand and told how O'Donoghue and his brother went out to look for Robert, knowing the places he liked to go. Mark did admit Robert was high energy and that when he would get home from work, he would always want to go outside and kick football or run around the garden, but to this it was not a negative to Mark, even when he was tired. The man and his son that found Robert's bike had said that the bike had not been there around 3 p.m. when they passed by, but when they passed again around 5 p.m. it was then they saw the bike, picked it up and brought it back to their house. Many witnesses also testified to O'Donoghue's form that day. He was suitably worried as one would be, but he was not acting out of character in any way that had them thinking he had anything to do with Robert's disappearance. Gardaí would say that O'Donoghue would become aggressive and give out to them for wasting time if they broke the search to discuss new tactics or if the weather was too bad. A few people also noted that O'Donoghue had an interest in the maps that were being used, in what areas had been searched and what direction the search was going in. One man that was searching with O'Donoghue told of how he was the last to see Robert and how he had refused to bring him into town to get chips. The man said to O'Donoghue, "So you were the last to see him. Did you kill him?" O'Donoghue went quiet and said nothing after that. The two Gardaí that spoke to the O'Donoghue family told how they came to be in the house that day, Wayne confessed. The day after the funeral, the newspapers were full of articles about Robert and how the bishop had asked for the killer to come forward. On seeing this, O'Donoghue went to his father, telling him he was the one who killed Robert and it was an accident. His mother came into the room then and saw her husband crying. The three went out into the garden shed to discuss the matter, away from the other children, so they would not hear. They decided that they would have to call the Gardaí and the family solicitor. The Gardaí arrived and sat down with O'Donoghue, his parents and their solicitor, and he made a statement. This took 7 hours and O'Donoghue refused to take breaks during this time. He said that Robert had called to his house asking him for a lift into town to McDonald's to get a milkshake, and Wayne had refused. So it went from chips to ice cream to milkshake, like which was it? Anyway, because Wayne had refused, he said Robert swore at him and Wayne told him to fuck off. In turn, Robert picked up pebbles and started to throw them at him and his car. Again, this statement would differ to others. Wayne would constantly change the details of what happened that day. He said when Robert threw the pebbles at his car, he gave him a little nudge to go away. As he turned to walk away towards the front door of his house, he felt more pebbles hit the back of his head. Again, he turned towards Robert, who was standing by his bike. He said he put his right arm around his neck and jerked him away from his bike towards the rear of the car. He then released his right hand and was still holding him by the scruff of the neck with his left hand, he said. Wayne then moved his left hand up to Robert's Adam's apple and held him against the car and said to him, quote, "Will you stop at the fucking stones?" He told Gardaí he did not know how long he held Robert or how tight his grip was on his throat. He did not intend to cause him any harm or injury, he said, but when he removed his hand from Robert's throat, he fell to the ground. Wayne brought Robert inside the house then and into the bathroom. He threw water on his face, trying to revive him, but he soon realised that Robert was dead. In realising this, he wiped his face with toilet paper and flushed it away. He said he just wanted to die and stood in front of the bathroom mirror with a knife he retrieved from the kitchen, but he couldn't go through with it. So instead he went to the kitchen once more and got bin bags from the press. Returning to the bathroom, he wrapped Robert's body and carried him to his car and placed him in the boot, along with his bike, which he left on the side of the road a few kilometres away from the house. He then drove to Inchstrand and dumped Robert in the ditch. Here he would lie for 6 days. He later returned to the body as he was feeling guilty about how he had left Robert. He tried to get him out of the ditch and carry him to the beach, but couldn't get him out. So instead he poured petrol over him and tried to set him alight. He planned to go home and hang himself in the shed, but by then people were already out looking for Robert, and he was kind of swept up in the search. Later that night he planned to hang himself on a tree in the back garden, but again he didn't. O'Donoghue's girlfriend also testified that she only lived a few minutes from his house. They had spoken on the phone at lunchtime that day Robert was killed. Then O'Donoghue turned up at her house to help her put a study timetable together as she was sitting her leaving cert that year. O'Donoghue had received a call from his brother to pick up an exercise bike in Cork, and so he left to do that. At around 4 p.m. she received a text from O'Donoghue telling her he was doing college stuff but would be by later. When he called later on, they watched TV and walked the O'Donoghue dog, and then played a game on the Xbox in O'Donoghue's room. Finally, they drove into Middleton to return a DVD to Extravision. He then dropped his girlfriend home, telling her he had more college things to do. She said he was normal the whole way through the day, and it wasn't until he phoned her that evening at 8:30 p.m. to tell her Robert was missing that he seemed upset, as any normal person would. He told her in this call that he felt responsible. If only he had brought Robert into town, he wouldn't be missing. She said she never saw Wayne get annoyed at Robert and that they were good friends, and that she was shocked when she heard he had killed Robert. The Gardaí that recovered the body said they had to use a cherry picker to lower themselves down into the 40-foot ditch. There was a tar residue around the body, which they realised was from the plastic being set alight, along with scorch marks on Robert's clothing. 2 videotapes of interviews were shown to the jury. One was the first tape where O'Donoghue was stating it was an accident, that he didn't mean to kill Robert, and that he would swap places with him if he could. It was all about O'Donoghue's feelings and how he wanted to take his own life. The Gardaí were softly in their approach. The second tape, that turned out to be a different kettle of fish. The Gardaí were having none of it and became more aggressive in their approach. They had enough of the woe is me mentality from O'Donoghue. They put it to him that his earlier statements were horseshit. They honed in on what exactly he had done to Robert, asking what the heck did he think would happen when he put young Robert in a headlock and grabbed him by the throat. All O'Donoghue kept repeating was he hadn't intended to hurt him. They asked him why didn't he ring 999? Why did he move Robert into the house? O'Donoghue admitted that he probably moved him into the house in case people driving by might see what happened. He was in a complete panic and it never crossed his mind to call for help. But it crossed his mind to bring Robert in so no one would see. He said he had no plans as to what he was going to do with Robert's body, and when he returned to where he had dumped the body, he could only see the black bags and not Robert. He thought he might have slipped out of the bags, and so he set the bags on fire to see further down the embankment. But still he couldn't see, and so he left Robert as he was. The state pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy also took to the stand. She said there was no fire damage to Robert's body. He had petechial hemorrhages behind his ears, on his scalp and on his mouth, and his brain was swollen, indicating that he had died from asphyxia. There were no marks on Robert's neck, except for a chain he was wearing left a mark. There were marks on his ribs which indicated that he was held tight around the front and that he died from a headlock. The marks to Robert's mouth, she said, was either a slap to the mouth or a hand being held over it. There were also deep bruises to his shoulder, back and buttocks, indicating that he was pushed hard against a solid object. The Gardaí also spoke of how they ended up at Inchstrand in search of Robert. They contacted the mobile phone provider, and because the signal was so weak in the countryside, it worked off 2 towers, and so they said Robert's phone was somewhere in between the 2 towers. And this information led Gardaí to finding the phone which was with Robert. A professor from Northern Ireland also gave evidence and described headlocks as extremely dangerous. He also said it was commonly used by the police force in the US to subdue their suspects, but it was no longer allowed because there had been so many accidental deaths. In closing, the prosecution gave their final summary of the case. They said that O'Donoghue had done everything and anything to cover up his crime. He had remained calm in the aftermath of what he had done. He had lied to the Gardaí and only told what had happened after Robert's body was found, and knew there might be evidence to connect him. The defence leaned on what the professor from Northern Ireland said in saying it had been a tragic accident, and that Dr. Mary Cassidy had not been able to rule that out as a possibility, and it made no sense that O'Donoghue would try and kill a boy he was friends with, who he brought into town for milkshakes and played with him often. On the 14th of December 2005, Justice Paul Carney gave his summing up and instructions to the jury. Deliberations began at 12 noon that day. Shortly after, they were called back. The defence wanted legal definitions broke down further, so the jury were in full understanding of what was needed of them. The jury were sent out again and again brought back in at 4 p.m, so the judge could check on their progress. They had not yet reached a verdict, and so Justice Carney said he would accept a 10-2 verdict, as he was satisfied he had given them enough time at this stage. Just in case you missed it, 4 hours was enough in the judge's eyes to reach a verdict of murder, manslaughter or innocent that related to a young boy of 11 whose neighbour took his life. Give me strength. 20 minutes later, the jury returned with the verdict of not guilty of murder. O'Donoghue wept, his parents wept, and most importantly, Robert's parents wept. Because O'Donoghue had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, he would be sentenced in January 2006, and so he was remanded back into custody. The Houlihan family left the court by a side door, and the O'Donoghue family solicitor read out a statement to the waiting media outside on the courthouse steps. They said their thoughts were with the Houlihans, and they thanked everyone that had helped them over the previous year. They were pleased with the verdict, but emphasised the tragedy that had occurred, and what they had been through paled in comparison to what the Houlihans went through. The O'Donoghues obviously forgot that the Houlihans will continue to go through this pain for the rest of their lives. On the 24th of January 2006, O'Donoghue appeared in court for sentencing, and it did not go as expected. When it comes to sentencing concerning manslaughter, it could go to no prison term, to time served, and from anything from 10 years upwards. Many factors are taken into account: how the accused cooperated, how evidence was presented in court by both sides, probation and medical reports on the accused, etc. Victim impact statements are also taken into consideration, which the judge reads and approves beforehand. Magella, Robert's mum, was the first to read her statement in front of the judge, but it didn't go the way everyone thought it would, including the judge. You see, our brave Magella went off script and asked questions she needed answers to, that were not answered during the trial. Her statement was 11 pages long, and she slowly but surely got through it, holding back her tears as she described her bright, beautiful boy. When she got to the final page, her tears turned to anger, and as she looked out across the courtroom, she said, quote, "Our doctors tell us to get on with our lives, but how can we when we know there were semen found on our child's body? There were no stone marks on O'Donoghue's car, according to forensics. If this was an accident, why didn't O'Donoghue call? Why was there no fingerprints found on Robert's phone, not even his own? Who wiped it clean? Who deleted images on it? Why did my little boy ring 999 that morning, as the phone records showed it did? Why was Robert in O'Donoghue's bedroom that morning at 7:30 a.m. when he was supposed to be on a sleepover?" O'Donoghue's defence objected through all these questions that were asked by Magella, but she stayed steadfast and spoke over all the objections, and then she left the stand. She had succeeded in blindsiding the whole court with her questions and accusations. A recess was called for and granted. When the court came back into session, the defence went mental and said that his client's reputation had been tarnished, and O'Donoghue, who had planned to make a statement, would no longer be doing so. Just as Paul Carney turned his attention to the Houlihan family and spoke to them directly, quote, "You are now most likely going to be disappointed in these next few moments," but that his sentence was not a reflection to the value of their son's life, nor was it about retribution. He had come to a fair sentence giving the facts and circumstances, the defendant's good character and the unlikelihood that he would re-offend. He also wanted to make sure that his ruling would not be overturned in the Court of Appeal. He sentenced O'Donoghue to a measly 4 years, including time served. While the sentencing should have been the main headlines, it was overshadowed by what Magella had said in her victim impact statement. It sent everyone into a frenzy, wanting the answers to her questions and answers as to why what she said was not in the trial. The Hoolahans again left the court by a side door. Over the next few weeks, there would be many debates on radio and TV nationwide about the leniency of O'Donoghue's sentence of 4 years and the nature of Robert and his relationship. Why a 20-year-old would want to hang around an 11-year-old that's not related to him and do the big brother act when he had brothers of his own. You could understand Robert looking up to O'Donoghue, but why would O'Donoghue entertain it? These were the questions being asked. The O'Donoghue solicitor agreed to many on-air interviews, and he was questioned about Magella's questions during the victim impact statement, which he did address. The most pressing question was about the semen found on Robert's body. He explained that the semen was found on his hand and it was minuscule. Initial tests carried out seemed to indicate that it belonged to O'Donoghue, but there was also semen found on the mat in O'Donoghue's bathroom, where Robert was placed after the killing, and this might explain it. The defence also had the small sample tested, and it did not match O'Donoghue. Initially, the prosecution had included this evidence in the book of evidence, but decided that it had little evidential value and did not use it in trial. As far as Robert being in O'Donoghue's house early that morning, he said Robert was the type that was always in and out of that house, from early morning to late in the evening. They had an open door policy with Robert. When it came to the 999 calls, Robert made them soon after first getting the phone, and he probably knew it was a free call to the Gardaí and did it messing. The Gardaí logged them as hang-ups because as soon as they answered them, the person hung up. The time Magella alleged Robert was in O'Donoghue's room with his phone was actually a few hours before he had bought the phone. Magella drew her conclusion that Robert was in the house that early morning because of an image found on the phone, a picture of a poster in O'Donoghue's room. It was dated the 28th of December 2004 at 7 a.m, but it would have been impossible for this photo to be taken at this time, as Robert hadn't even bought the phone until 4 hours later. The answer to this is Robert hadn't set the correct time and date as yet, and so saying that Robert was also there on the morning of the killing was also wrong. The Hoolahans were having none of it and released a statement to state that Magella said nothing that wasn't in the book of evidence, and the defence could have cross-examined her about her victim impact statement, but they chose not to. Why? They said their questions were valid and based on facts in the file, and she deserves answers to these questions. Magella also sent out a letter to the DPP requesting that the case be sent to the Court of Appeal. Of course, amidst all of this, newspapers were running wild with analysis and speculation, and even fresh accusations, putting forward that there were 2 semen samples found on the body, which Gardaí denied and said was untrue. The O'Donoghue family sent out a statement that the relationship between Robert and Wayne was friendship and the DNA samples had not been identified and so was not put forward for trial. Again, they sent sympathies to the Hoolahan family and said they were in their prayers daily. In February 2006, the state would go on to file an appeal against O'Donoghue's sentencing, saying that Justice Carney had failed to take into account the age difference between O'Donoghue and Robert. Robert's injuries and too much weight had been put on the fact O'Donoghue had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but not enough weight to the fact he covered up the killing and concealed the body. O'Donoghue's solicitors would contest the appeal and seek to serve out the sentence he was given. While they were waiting on the results of the appeal, the coroner's inquiry began. This does not usually happen until a trial is over, as an accurate cause of death has to be written on the death certificate, and with an ongoing case, obviously, this hasn't been determined. The Hoolahan family did attend this court in Middleton and made the unusual move of questioning the witnesses themselves. Mark Hoolahan asked a Garda if he thought it was a sexually motivated killing, to where the coroner intervened, saying it was an inappropriate question and they were there to determine the cause of death and nothing else. Dr. Mary Cassidy also took to the stand, and Majella put 19 questions to her, trying to put a new narrative to what happened to Robert. One of these questions was, did Robert suffer? Dr. Cassidy said it was unlikely, as he would have been unconscious very quickly due to the nature of his death. The inquiry was adjourned after the Gardaí requested that the inquiry be resumed after the Court of Appeal came back with their verdict. In October 2006, the Court of Appeal came back with their verdict. It was a lengthy reply, with the judges going through each item of the state's application. The appeal was denied and the 4-year sentence stood. In 2008, O'Donoghue was released from prison after serving just 3 years. He received the standard 25% remission for good behaviour. On leaving the prison, he made a statement outside the prison gates. He accepted full responsibility for not only the loss of life of Robert, but for the grief and distress he caused the Houlihan family owing to his actions. He knows that nothing he will ever say will ease their suffering, and he would carry the burden of that for the rest of his life. He also apologised to the local community and the wider community and asked for forgiveness. He also included his sorrow towards his family and friends for the pain and suffering he caused them, and thanked them for the love and support they had given him over the past 3 years. O'Donoghue left the country shortly after his release and finished university in Leeds in the UK and became an architect. He also found himself a girlfriend and changed his name to Patrick. So basically, he picked up where he left off and got on with his life. It's a pity Robert wasn't given the same opportunity. I know you were saying he received his sentence, he served it, and be done with it. You go to court for justice and all you get is injustice. O'Donoghue went on to sue 3 newspapers and a TV station for running with the whole paedophile story, among other things, and he was successful. That is, they all settled out of court, so he got a nice few bob to help him along the way. Just to clarify, the forensic trail for semen had produced more than one strand of DNA, which resulted in complications that eventually caused the semen evidence to founder. The bat mat had become a particular focus of attention, because O'Donoghue had argued that any semen on Robert's body could have been transferred from the bat mat, where he had placed Robert. Forensics couldn't find O'Donoghue's semen on the bat mat or Robert. They did, however, find a second semen sample on the bat mat. This semen was traced to an innocent individual, which matched the sample taken from Robert's hand. So this is why it was not included in the trial. The man is fond of suing, so I'd better mind myself, and that is why I wanted to clarify this accusation and say it was false. Oh, and he also wrote a book, which I won't be advertising here. In 2007, at a lecture in Cork, Justice Paul Carney criticised Majella Houlihan for remarks she made at the sentencing of O'Donoghue. He accused Majella of frustrating his intention of providing for the reconstruction of O'Donoghue's life by adding unscripted comments to her prepared victim impact statement. Justice Carney did try and retract his statement later on, but his words had already hit the media. Majella would respond by saying she was hurt and offended by the judge's remarks, that she had to say what she did in her victim impact statement. These were matters that any responsible mother would have alluded to, and if she had not, she would not have done justice to her much-loved son. I think Majella knew that what she got to say was more important to her than the sentence O'Donoghue was going to get. I think Majella knew it was going to be a pitiful sentence, and so she gave herself, her husband, her living children a voice, and of course Robert a voice. The saying goes, actions speak louder than words, but that day in court Majella proved that wrong, and I commend her for standing up for her son. Majella would go on to have another baby in 2008, a little girl. They became a family of 5, but they will always be a family of 6. Rest in peace, Robert.